Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today are the issue of conduct during war, of soldiers' conduct during war, mainly as a response to the horrific atrocities that are being uncovered in Ukraine, right? As Soviet forces are pulling back, the horrific discoveries of mass graves and just bodies lying on the street and in buildings, et cetera, et cetera. It's really, really barbaric. And in terms of a Jewish response to this, so on the one hand, in the Torah, we're commanded several times about what we're supposed to do, what the people of Israel are supposed to do when they're about to enter the land of Israel, right? So where we're up to in the Torah right now in the cycle of weekly readings, we haven't gotten to that point yet. What we have gotten to is what are the laws by which we frame our society. So we have the Ten Commandments, we have a civil law, we have religious law, how to do the sacrifices. And in the book of Numbers, when they finally leave Mount Sinai, so everything from Exodus 15 through the book of Leviticus all takes place at Mount Sinai. It's not until the book of Numbers that the people start moving away from Mount Sinai. And at that point, after Moses has a representative of each tribe, 12 scouts, scout out the land, that they were getting ready to get into the land of Israel. And then there are laws that are presented about what you're supposed to do when you get to the land of Israel. Mainly, that is, you're supposed to wage war against the indigenous population, but not war in the usual sense, but rather a total annihilation of the indigenous population. Okay, so we have that about the Amalekites. So once they left Egypt, crossed the sea, the Amalekites attacked, but they attacked from behind to attack the old, the weak, the women and the children. And so we're told to annihilate the Amalekites because of how they attacked us. So we're supposed to annihilate the Amalekites, but also the 7 indigenous nations, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Hittites, etc., who live in the land of Canaan, what will become the land of Israel. So that's supposed to be a total annihilation. So that's from the Torah. In the book of Joshua, when they and the book of Judges, when they start settling the land of Israel, they don't do that. It is not a total annihilation process. It's rather waging war in the conventional sense. Soldiers against soldiers, men against men. That's the conventional kind of war. So in the Torah and in the Bible, the war that we know of is war in the land of Israel to make the land of Israel become Israelite and to try to eradicate any kind of idolatrous residue that would be left behind. And the Bible then is a recounting of Israel's failure in doing that, and how they were influenced, and many of the kings of Israel, I'd say most of the kings of Israel, were influenced by idolatrous practice and even brought idolatrous practice into Israelite culture. So the process of waging war for the Bible, and therefore the historical Jewish perspective, is about eradicating idolatrous pagan practice. So war is not for the sake of establishing an empire, but rather it's for a religious reason, to eradicate idolatry. So when you fast forward into rabbinic literature after the Mishnah and the Talmud, there isn't much in rabbinic literature about how to wage war, because for two reasons. One, war for the rabbis is, when you look at the Torah and the Bible to be the source for Jewish law, war is all about how to settle the land of Israel. Okay? And number two, in all of the years, 4,000 years of Jewish history, how many years have we been autonomous in the land of Israel? Out of those 4,000 years, maybe 500. You have from Judges until the Babylonians. So maybe that's 400 or 500 years at the most. And then you have maybe 100 years under the Maccabees. After the Maccabees, the kings of Israel were called the Hasmoneans. So you have 100 years there. And now we have another 74, right? So out of all that time, so throughout rabbinic literature, Mishnah, Talmud, throughout the Middle Ages until modern times, there's no such thing as an autonomous Jewish presence in the land of Israel. And in fact, what you have are Jews, wherever they're living, being oppressed and persecuted. So it's kind of hard for an oppressed, persecuted people without a country to have definite laws about how to wage war, because we don't have the means to do it. We don't have a country by which to do that. So it's only in 1948, when the state of Israel is established, that the leaders of Israel had to come up with an Israeli version of how to conduct war. So they needed policy by which the army of Israel would conduct its business of engaging militarily. Okay, so I wouldn't necessarily say that it has to be just when you're engaged in war, but any kind of military conflict or any kind of military engagement needs policy by which you do that, so that soldiers are trained in how to conduct their business as efficiently and as ethically as possible. So the American Army has rules of engagement. Armies around the world have rules of engagement, and they follow United Nations protocol or conventions or treaties that have been passed by mostly Western democracies. So the issue, so two things before we get to Ukraine. One is, so for Israel very clearly has a policy called Tohar HaNeshek. Those two words means purity of arms. So, which seems to be a contradiction in terms. How could arms, weapons, be pure? They are the opposite of pure. They cause bloodshed. But the Israeli army consulted with military leaders, philosophers, rabbis to come up with its policy of engagement. Okay, so I'm not going to go through that. You can Google Israel's purity of arms, Israeli army purity of arms, and you'll see articles that will come up that will explain all of that. So clearly, what Israel's army is called the Israel Defense Forces for a reason, and that the purpose of having an army for Israel to have an army is to defend itself, not to expand its borders, but to defend its borders. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind, and that goes to an underlying principle of what on which a foundation on which Israel's army is based ethically. We defend the citizens of Israel and the borders of Israel from any kind of incursion. Two, in the process of defending ourselves, we have to ensure that we are engaging military targets, not civilian targets. I mean, that's a basic element of any kind of army acting ethically. You engage military targets. And so that what has been complicated in Israel's existence is dealing with terrorists who look like civilians and do not look like a regular army. That's number one. And number two, when Israel's army engages like Hamas in Gaza, what happens when the military target is in a school or a mosque or a hospital or an apartment building, right? So Hamas leaders, political leaders, had meetings in an apartment building. Israel knew that. Israel's intelligence led them to an apartment in an apartment building where all the Hamas leaders were. So Israel has a choice. Knock out the leaders, but in doing so, you knock out the entire apartment building. Innocent civilians would be killed at the expense of killing those Hamas leaders. So Israel, in trying to be purity of arms, to engage militarily only, and to be as ethical as possible, has its adversary not following the same rules. So it's one thing, when there were, I think of the Broadway musical Hamilton, when there are duels, right? There's a certain honor that you have to protect, and you do this in a very gentlemanly kind of way. There are rules in how to engage in a duel with somebody else. So there were rules in how to engage. Why did World War I last so long in the trenches there? Because there were rules in how to engage with the other side that, for the most part, the two sides were following, for the most part, aside from the mustard gas. Otherwise, there were rules of engagement that you knew that on one side, the other side is going to follow as well. The challenge is when the other side doesn't follow those rules, then what? How are we, who are following the rules, whether we being Israel or we being allies supporting Ukraine, how are we supposed to respond when the other side engages in atrocities? Okay, so that's the ethical and moral challenge. So Israel constantly, when it battles terrorists, when it battles Hamas, has to live have an ethical discussion in the leadership, right? So they don't know how many minutes they have to engage the target that might be in the apartment building. So they quickly have to have a meeting. What do? We weigh the pros and cons of killing those leaders and how many people, then how many civilians would be killed in the process, right? So that's what and then they have to decide, we step back. We're not going to engage, we're going to save those civilians, okay? And Hamas knows this and takes advantage of this. And other Palestinian terrorists know this, that they can take advantage of Israel's morality and ethics by playing games like this and playing games with their own civilians, their own people. So, I've had classes with somebody named Tal Becker from the Hartman Institute, who was one of Israel's representatives in the Oslo Accord negotiations with the Palestinians. So Tal Becker is an immigrant to Israel from Australia. He is a lawyer, and he is a brilliant guy in presenting all these issues. If you Google Tal Becker, I'm sure you'll see articles that Tal is his first name, and then Becker. So you'll see articles that he has written, which are really, really fascinating stuff about how to even backing up more. What's a definition of a terrorist, and then understanding then how to deal with a terrorist and how to engage in battle with a terrorist in order to protect Israel from that. And he's worked with the United Nations as one of lawyers from countries to try to define what a terrorist is, so that everybody knows what a terrorist is and how to then deal with terrorism. So it's not easy. It's not black and white to be able to have an easy definition of what a terrorist is. Okay, so there's that element to dealing with atrocities in war and trying to limit when these atrocities happen. And just a second, Lori. And certainly Israel does make mistakes. There's when Israel went into Lebanon in 1982, it went all the way to Beirut, and it had allies there on the ground. And so there were the so-called refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, and a massacre that happened there. Was Israel to blame for the massacre that took place in the refugee camp by one segment of Palestinian or Lebanese against another segment of population there? Scores of people killed, etc. Was Israel to blame for that? So there was a big investigation as a result of that, because Israel's army was there. It should have conducted itself in a certain way, and it should have ensured the safety of everybody, civilians on the ground, while they were engaging with the Palestinian terrorists to try to get Arafat. Okay, so there you have responsibility, and army has a responsibility when it engages in battle to ensure that they're only engaging militarily and they're protecting people, even enemy civilians, from battle. Okay, so there's that element too, to ensure that ancillary kind of things that happen, you're responsible for also. Lori, what did you want to ask?
Yeah, just a quick question. Would it be fair to say, I'm just trying to make sure I understand, that the Israeli army's approach is based in Jewish ethics and values, but not specifically on Jewish law?
Right. So that's why the background before I got to the Israeli army was to say that there's not much in Jewish law about how to engage in war. And that the only war that we have examples of from the Torah and from the Bible are in the land of Israel itself, and how to eradicate the indigenous pagan population. So there's nothing there about how to deal with non-pagans when you go to war with non-pagans. So Maimonides has some law about war in his summary of Jewish law called the Mishneh Torah, but it's based on other aspects of ethics of conducting our Jewish life. And so, you know, there is the idea that you're allowed to kill, but you're not allowed to murder. And that, right, so you're allowed to protect yourself. And you're allowed to preemptively protect yourself. So in other words, if you see somebody coming who's about to do you harm, but hasn't done you harm yet, you're allowed to preempt and harm that person, or prevent that person from doing harm to you. Okay, so you can expand that individual law to a whole country of how a country is supposed to conduct itself preemptively to protect itself from the other country. So there are ways then, if there aren't specific examples of how to wage war, of other things in law that you can use as a basis for deriving these things. So when the Israeli army came up with its policy, it worked not just with whatever the kind of treaties were already there that Israel decided to sign on to as a country, but also then adding other things based on Jewish law to it as well. Okay, so the question then now is how to respond Jewishly to what we see on the ground has been happening in Ukraine. Again, I walk a fine line here in not wanting to get into politics of what America should do to respond to the atrocities on the ground in Ukraine, but rather how we respond Jewishly, how we respond ethically and morally to what we see clearly Russia has done on the ground. And so part of this is how Israel is walking a fine line now too, because as I said a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the war in Ukraine in general, the problem that Israel has in taking a stand. Israel should be taking a moral stand against Russia. It should, and in support of Ukraine. Absolutely should be doing this, but it can't because Russia is on the ground in Syria. So if Israel says something wrong that could rub Putin the wrong way, then Israel doesn't know what Putin might do to Israel because they're right next door in Syria. So, though we may be upset as Jews that the foreign minister of Israel and the prime minister of Israel haven't come out strongly against Russia, we need to understand why Israel isn't doing that. Okay, so because Israel's security is at stake. Russia clearly has some issues with invading Ukraine. Its army is disorganized, whatever, but still it has pretty dangerous weapons at its disposal. So you don't want to rub Russia the wrong way when it has nuclear weapons there, and you never know what Putin would do in response to Prime Minister Bennett and Foreign Minister Lapid saying that Putin has committed war crimes. So Lapid has said it looks like that the atrocities have been committed, but he hasn't said Putin has committed war crimes. Okay, so unlike President Biden, who has said that. So, I personally can't blame Bennett and Lapid for not being so forcefully strong and unambiguous against Russia. Okay. However, I can, as an American Jew, be appalled and cry out in protest to what Russia is doing on the ground in Ukraine and how Russia needs to be punished for this. Absolutely needs to be punished. Now, Russian civilians shouldn't be punished, but the Russian government should absolutely be punished. And Putin and generals should be brought to trial for what they've done in Ukraine in such a barbaric, horrific kind of way, and that there should be, we should come out in support of the Ukrainian government, of the Ukrainian citizens, and say, we're here for you. We provide whatever support we need. Should we be advocating that we go to war in Ukraine against Russia? I don't know. I really don't know, because it looks like a simple answer, that the simple answer should be yes, but it's not so simple, because there are so many layers to this, that when a dangerous person has so many powerful weapons at his disposal, you don't know what, but we should be, and I think Jewishly we can say this, we should be doing everything on the ground to protect the Ukrainians from the Russian army. And I don't know how best to do that, but a life is a life, and all life is precious, and we need to do our best. Al ta'amod al dam reyecha is what the book of Leviticus says. Don't stand on the blood of your neighbor. We can't stand, it's commonly translated, don't stand idly by. We have to get involved. We have to do what we can to protect people, to save people from imminent danger. But I don't know the best way to do this. So, questions or comments about this? So I want to stop here because it's 11:30, so we've had 30 minutes, but the delivery people are going to come any second. I expected them 15 minutes ago, but they're going to be here any second, and this seems to be a good spot to pause. And we'll continue next week. Next Monday, we will meet again for another edition of Jews and the News. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Take care.